Intelligence reports indicate that a high-ranking enemy leader, Maxwell, has visited a camp in Sector U, the mercenary headquarters in Africa. The general said in French, "This will be his last night. Of course, given the nature of the operation, we cannot deploy many people. There are 49 people from 5 units here, and of course, there will be no air support," he said. One of the soldiers asked how many men the enemy had, and it turned out that the minimum was 350 and the maximum was 500. Sitting among the soldiers, Darren did not know French, so he asked a comrade named Charlie to translate, but he asked him to shut up. The general continued to say that the goal of the operation was not suppression by fire. After killing Maxwell, everyone should stop fighting and retreat. Darren turned back to the boy to see what the man was saying. However, at that moment the general shouted at the distracted young men. All attention was focused on Charlie. The guy sat in a confident pose with a stern face and looked at the boss. He ordered them not to be distracted. The young man asked the commander to continue his monologue. The man looked at Charlie with irritation. They pierced each other with their eyes. The general replied that at any other time he would have responded, but today he would ignore it. "Today is a very important day for all of us," he said. Charlie had been listening to him attentively all this time. Soon their meeting ended and the military was ordered to go and get ready. A few hours later, a quiet and gloomy night set in. Only the noise from the engine disturbed the tranquility of nature. In the military vehicle, everyone was asleep and snoring, except Charlie. When the transport stopped, the young man jumped to the ground and began to wake everyone up, because from this place they would go on foot. Once everyone was on their feet, he warned everyone to check their gear and weapons, and for now, they could take a smoke break. Then Stephen approached Captain Charlie, who had just started smoking. Holding a cigarette in his teeth, the comrade winked. He asked if they would go today after the mission, but did not finish the sentence but showed a vulgar, obscene gesture with his hands. Charlie got angry because the blonde's head was filled with other things. Now it was more important to think about survival. Stephen lit a cigarette and calmly said, "What's the problem? After all, the god of Blackfield is next to us." The captain smiled indulgently and soon threw his cigarette on the ground, saying that they were finished. He stubbed out the cigarette butt that had fallen to the ground with his boot, and the whole team moved forward after the leader. The team made their way through the jungle very quietly and carefully. Suddenly, the captain gestured for everyone to stop. There were about 2 kilometers left to the destination. So far, everything was going smoothly, but what is this strange feeling of anxiety that Charlie has? Stephen asked him what was the matter. He noted that the captain looked somehow unwell. The young man shared that he had a bad feeling. The blonde grinned. Was the god of Blackfield sure? At this point, the military man laughed, deciding to joke that the captain was about to retire. However, something interrupted his speech. At that moment, Stephen received a bullet in the stomach and began to bleed. Immediately, many bullets flew at the team. Charlie ordered everyone to duck immediately. The boys hid behind the trees, which were being fired upon from all sides. A terrible attack began on them. The bullets never ended. In the midst of all this horror, Charlie dragged his comrade. The wounded Stephen was bleeding and not moving at all. The captain was terribly worried about him, trying to save him with all his might. Somehow, the young man managed to reach a tree for shelter. What is this, a mortar attack? It doesn't look like we caught them by surprise, Charlie thought. He asked a subordinate hiding nearby if everyone was okay, and it turned out that everything was fine for now. The enemies knew in advance that they were coming, so there were more of them and they were in cars. People fired at the detachment with automatic weapons and machine guns. Dodging the bullets, Charlie tried to shoot back. The young man shot 2 enemies in the head who were driving a car with machine guns. And immediately after, a bullet pierced the windshield and killed the driver. The car lost control and crashed into several people at high speed, crashing into a tree. Charlie approached Stephen and asked if he should be given morphine. The blonde replied that it was not necessary. He did not even understand where he was. After examining his body, the captain realized that the bleeding was severe and that the internal organs were also affected. He encouraged his comrade by assuring him that he only had a scratch and there was nothing to be afraid of. One of the guys turned to Charlie. "What are we gonna do?" The guy understood that Stephen was seriously injured, and if they wanted to survive, they had to retreat. "Captain, you understand everything," Stephen groaned. Writhing in pain, he asked to leave. "You're crazy," Charlie thought, gritting his teeth. The young man shouted at his comrade and began to ask furiously, "Who am I?" The soldier was breathing heavily, sweat running down his face. He repeated his question even louder, placing his hands on his shoulders. Stephen smiled, looking at the captain, and he said, "You are the god of Blackfield." At this moment, an explosion is heard nearby. The shell-shocked young man doesn't understand what this is. Suddenly, he hears someone nearby groaning in pain. The The sounds came from Darren, so Charlie turned to face him. The wounded Darren insisted that everything was fine, hiding behind a tree that was currently being furiously fired upon. The captain begged him to hold on a little longer. They were practically at the camp. After these words, Charlie ran straight into the bullets. But almost immediately, his skull is pierced by an enemy attack. Everything suddenly started spinning, and the ground started slipping out from under my feet. A moment later, the young man fell, bleeding, barely able to see anything around him. Lying on the ground in his own blood, Charlie suddenly realized that someone had shot him in the head from behind. The enemy began to approach their group. The captain's eyes slowly darkened. Only one thought remained with him until his death. A sniper? Who was it? After that, the young man passed out. There was darkness all around. The back of his head was splitting with pain. He was very thirsty. Was the young man dead? The barely distinguishable voices of people could be heard all around. The light slowly penetrated his eyes. The voices were in Korean. "You are lucky. You are young, so you recover quickly," someone said. The picture and sounds became clearer and clearer. The doctor said, "Student, are you awake?" Finally, the guy opened his eyes and a bright light hit them. The doctor standing next to the patient asked the nurse to check the numbers. As it turned out, patient Charlie Ross had regained consciousness, so the nurse called the doctor. The worried doctor turned to him. He began to check his vision with a flashlight. The doctor assumed that due to the fact that the young man had previously been involved in sports, he was recovering quickly. The doctor began to ask the young man about his mood and well-being. At the same time, the man took out some cotton wool with tweezers. While his face was being wiped with it, the patient was able to quietly ask, "What is this place?" He was told that he was in Seoul Hospital in Gangnam. The doctor asked the nurse to contact the relatives, as the young man was in a stable condition. "If it's Gangnam, then it's definitely Korea, but who brought it here?" The doctor answered quite calmly that it was an ambulance. The patient couldn't believe this nonsense. How could there be an ambulance where he was? The man asked the nurse to look after him, as the student woke up 3 days later and was not fully recovered. Charlie stood up abruptly. He was indignant that everyone was calling him a student. Then he noticed something. He quickly got out of bed and onto the floor barefoot. The doctor wanted to warn him that it was too early for him to get up, but the guy had already headed to the other end of the ward. The patient walked up to the mirror and dug his hands into the sink. Charlie touched his reflection and was horrified. He was in the body of a young student guy. What is that? After a few days in the hospital, the boy was heading home. The boy knew his name was Charlie Ross and that he was 29 years old. Profession: commander of a detachment of mercenary forces of France. In July 2016, Charlie was on a battlefield in Africa when he was knocked unconscious by gunfire. It would be more accurate to say that the young man died on the battlefield. And in 2019, he woke up in South Korea. The guy was in a coma for 3 days but woke up because he switched bodies. The most amazing thing is that here his name is also Charlie Ross, only he is 19 and a senior in his senior year. He goes to Sinmin High School in Gangnam, fell from the roof of the school building, lost consciousness, and came to his senses 3 days later. That's what Charlie was told. But naturally, it was not he who came to his senses, but I, thought the young man. He was distracted from his thoughts by a female voice asking if he remembered the house where he lived. Sitting next to him is a woman named Sophia Ross. She is his mother. Their conversation is interrupted by the driver who asks Sophia not to rush. The doctor said that the memory will return if you avoid unnecessary stress and rest more, said Jim, the student's father. After a while, they drove up to the house. Their car pulled into a free parking space in front of the entrance, and the father invited everyone to come inside. They went up to the floor and entered the apartment. The mother asked again if her son remembered his home, but the father interrupted her. He hugged Charlie and asked him not to worry about anything and to go and rest in his room. The young man was faced with a choice, which door to enter to get into his room. Father kindly suggested that his bedroom was on the left. Ross tugged the door handle carefully. He stopped and suddenly looked back unnoticed, after which he immediately went inside. Mom and Dad looked after him with excitement. When they were alone, they shared their concerns about their son. Meanwhile, Charlie admired the room, which was 100 times better than the personal room of the mercenary commander. This kid was just a rich guy. The most important thing among all of this is that the workplace with a computer is the most pleasing. The student decided to turn it on by pressing the button. He settled into a comfortable chair, however. A login password appeared on the screen, which he, naturally, did not know. There was a telephone lying on a stand on the table which caught his attention. The young man took it, because you can use the internet on your smartphone. Unfortunately, it also had a password set. Charlie didn't understand why so many passwords were set. Here he feels a round surface on the back of the phone. Thanks to his fingerprint, He was able to unlock the phone. It was obvious because Charlie was in the body of the owner of this phone. Who knows? Maybe he will be able to find some thread leading to the solution of his death and transfer into this body. However, an internet search for 2016 Battle in Africa Masalan yielded no results. Maybe it's because the boy was searching for it in Korean. Ross typed the same query, but in English. There were no results, so he decided to try French. He was interrupted by an unexpected message from Lewis Clark. "Charlie, I heard you were discharged from the hospital," asked the blonde. It was unclear whether this guy was his friend or not. He had to quickly answer something and continue his business. "Yes, I just got discharged," the young man replied. However, the next message surprised Charlie. Clark began to snap back in an insulting tone and say why he didn't report this to him. Did he really want to die? Ross was confused. Wasn't this the student's friend? But it didn't matter. So he continued what he had started. But Lewis didn't finish writing. He complained about why he wasn't answering him. This guy had already begun to irritate the former captain with his obsession. To get rid of him, the young man wrote that he was busy. After that, he immediately received a call on his phone. The guy smiled with interest at Clark's reaction. The student picked up the phone and immediately began to shout insults at him. His screams brought a smile to Ross's face. "He's become completely brazen. He swallowed a bunch of drugs in the hospital to gain courage," Lewis said. The young man calmly repeated that he was busy and warned that he was hanging up, which caused an even greater storm of emotions in his interlocutor. The blonde started to threaten, but the brunette cut him off and hung up. Charlie assumed that he would call him again. "That's why I blocked his contact on my account." At this time, screams could be heard from the roof of the school. Louis was furious that Charlie had dared to block him. In anger, he threw the phone so hard that its glass cracked. Clark was breathing heavily. He was terribly angry. There was only hatred in his eyes. One of his friends asked him why he was throwing phones around. "I don't care. I'll just tell that idiot Charlie to buy me another one," the bully said. His friend started laughing at him. Did Lewis ever spend his cash on anything? "Just come to school, Ross," Clark said menacingly. Soon night fell in the city. The brunette was still sitting at the table in his room. He looked through various news articles but couldn't find any mention of that battle. Was it a security measure or some other reason? Thoughts about this did not give him peace. That's why such a large flow made him want to smoke. The young man began to search the shelves. Perhaps the student had something hidden away. But after searching, it became clear that this puppy was apparently really an excellent student. There was still hope that he hid the pack among the books. When Charlie opened one of the cabinets, he saw a lot of trash. Taking one of the notebooks, he thought that it would be an ideal place for a stash. However, instead of cigarettes, he found the student's notes. "I gave them money today, and still I don't understand why these guys are treating me like this. Where did I go wrong? I didn't do anything." Charlie read the pages where the boy described his suffering, where he had already begun to believe in his insignificant existence because of his offenders. It was scary. Ross thought that Lewis's behavior was strange, so this kid is an outcast? Every page was covered with vows to kill those bastards who had mocked him. What a fool, Charlie thought. If you want to kill someone, just go and kill them quietly. In the end, no cigarettes were found. And this kid turned out to be some kind of scapegoat. One way or another, the young man was very tired and lay down on the bed. As soon as he closed his eyes, he immediately fell asleep. A few hours later, a new day began. In the morning, Charlie's father drove him to school. The young man himself sat sullenly in the back seat. Jim saw his son's condition in the rearview mirror and was very worried about his son. After some time, they finally arrived at the school gates. My father asked, "Are you sure you're okay? You could stay at home for a couple of days." Charlie came to his senses a little and replied that everything was fine. Jim smiled and asked not to strain himself too much. The student smiled politely in response and agreed. The young man got out of the car and walked into the schoolyard. Only now did he realize that he didn't know which office he needed to go to. He looked around. There were many students around. It would be nice if someone showed him everything here. Suddenly, someone from the crowd called out to Charlie. At that very moment, everyone around began to whisper and glance sideways. Lewis walked confidently towards him and said cheekily, "Isn't this the same Charlie who grew balls of steel in the hospital?" The young man looked at the blonde man carefully. He saw that his badge said Lewis Clark and realized that this was the same man he had spoken to on the phone. The enraged hooligan shouted loudly, reminding them of their conversation yesterday. Charlie began to smile, chuckling a little. "What are you laughing at? Have you been sniffing glue?" Louis started snapping. Ross's face was beaming with happiness. His guidebook was in front of him. But Clark's facial expressions indicated that a fight was about to happen. Not understanding what the young man was talking about, the blonde asked him again. "You are Lewis Clark, aren't you?" Charlie asked happily. "Yes, bastard, I am Louis Clark, to whom you always brought cigarettes and lunches without question," the hooligan yelled throughout the yard. Without any embarrassment, the brunette asked to give him a cigarette if he had one. Ross extended his hand with a friendly smile. Clark began to flex his fists. He wanted to wait until lunch, but the student apparently couldn't wait. He ordered the brunette to follow him, quickly turning away and walking away. He didn't even doubt that Charlie would not follow him. Soon the two of them entered the empty gym. After walking forward a little, Louis stopped. He turned around with a grin, looking at the young man. The blonde was the first to decide to start intimidating Charlie, aiming punches at him. "Do you know how hard it was for me without you?" said the impudent Clark. His fists froze in the air, a few centimeters from the student's face. "Bastard, did you want to die?" Clark said. But his verbal attack was interrupted by a powerful blow to the face from Ross. "Why are you talking so much?" asked the brunette. Louis flew a couple of meters away from him from the force of the blow, but Charlie immediately runs up to his body. And again he swings for another hard blow. His hand moves towards the guy's head at an insane speed. But suddenly the brunette stops himself. He understands that if he fights seriously, he might kill the bully, but he doesn't want to do that. Charlie decided to search the hooligan's pockets in the hope of finding cigarettes. But, unfortunately, he didn't have any cigarettes. The young man decided to leave Louis lying there. The guy was lost in his thoughts. In his head, Ross began to address the student. "You see this. I don't know where you are now, but you can look at this and calm down a little." Meanwhile, behind his back, Louis began to come to his senses. Clark slowly began to rise to his feet. How angry he was at Charlie, who had suddenly become bolder. The blonde pushed away sharply and headed towards Ross to beat him up. The brunette himself noticed the enraged body approaching him. "You hit me in the face!" Ross tried to attack Clark, screaming, but he dodged. The next blow also missed the student, and the offended blonde said, "Are you crazy?" Charlie was alarmed that the bully recovered so quickly after his blow. To calm the rebellious brat, the brunette hit him in the face again. The force of the blow made it seem as if the place where it hit was smoking. Louis got really angry and stuttered and insulted the young man. Here Charlie realized that he was not in his own body, and the fist was not his. Therefore, the strength was different. Since it wasn't possible to knock him out with one blow then, he was going to beat him until it had an effect. Once again, Louis received a punch in the same place. The guy pushed off the parquet floor to gain speed. Clark didn't give up and ran towards the student again. And again he missed, in addition to receiving a powerful, by body standards, uppercut. Ross's gaze was focused solely on his target, and his fist was aimed. And again, with a sharp and hard blow to the head, he knocks the hooligan off his feet. There was cruelty in his eyes, and his fist never stopped hitting. The young man was very angry, and abrasions from the blows were already starting to appear on his arm. Hands covered in blood, eyes full of rage, Louis lay bloodied and unconscious on the floor. Charlie stared at him, his fist hanging in the air. At that moment, the student remembered he wanted to find an office, so he stood up. Soon the guy left the gym. He looked around as he walked through the schoolyard, hoping to figure out where he needed to go. Suddenly, someone called out from behind Charlie. A pretty girl started to approach him. "At school already?" she asked. The young man still looked at her with incomprehension. A student who looked like Snow White started asking about the extract. The name tag said Kate Diaz, but what kind of relationship are they in? In any case, he was a third-year student, so it was not necessary to use a formal style of speech. Kate apologized for not being able to visit him, as additional tasks took precedence over her free time. Diaz shared that everyone in the class was worried about the boy's condition. "Are we classmates?" Ross asked the girl. "We sit at the same desk," the girl reminded. She began to reach her hand towards his head, afraid that something was wrong with her, but the young man dodged it and said that everything was fine. Charlie turned abruptly and called for her to come. Well, for starters, he will at least be able to find an office thanks to the girl. A little later, the guys entered the office. The young man sat by the window and realized that this was the perfect view for a shot. Here, the office doors opened suddenly. The whole class turned around to see who had entered. It turned out to be Louis, burning with anger and resentment, covered in blood. Everyone in the class started whispering about his broken face, assuming that he had gotten into trouble with the bullies from another school again. Charlie looked at him sideways. "Is this puppy also a classmate?" Without taking his eyes off Ross, Clark pushed back his chair. He sat against the opposite wall and deliberately turned around so as to pierce the impudent fellow with his gaze. The face, swollen and covered in blood, expressed hatred and disgust. Charlie didn't pay any attention to him. The guy was getting on his nerves. Louis took his phone out onto the table. He wrote to someone, "This Ross has gone completely crazy. Everyone leave during the first lesson." This bastard won't get off easy, Clark thought. The physical education lesson began. The whole class lined up in sports uniforms outside. The teacher looked carefully at those present in the class. "What about the uniform?" he asked Charlie, who was standing in his usual school uniform. Kate said in his defense that the young man had been in hospital for some time and had only recently returned. The coach quickly understood the situation and asked the guy not to strain himself too much and to rest in the shade. "Today you can play football, basketball, or dodgeball. The main thing is not to hurt yourself," the teacher announced. While the boys were playing football, the teacher stepped away for a while. Ross sat down on the steps alone. Lewis noticed him immediately. Charlie's mind was filled with, "I was in an unclear situation one way or another. What to do next?" He was rudely interrupted by a hooligan who approached him. "Anything else to say?" Charlie asked. "You think you can get off that easy?" "Get up, let's move away," Clark answered fiercely. The blonde turned away and walked forward with an angry gait. "They won't understand until they die," the young man sighed. There was nothing else to do, so Charlie followed him. Charlie didn't show any emotion on his face, although he was a little curious about what was waiting for him. And soon, they arrived at the place, where, besides the student and Louis, there were 5 more hooligans. "Haha, have you come?" The guy with the mask grinned. "Look at Lewis's face," the thug began to mock. "Did Charlie really paint you like that?" The 5 hooligans began to smile evilly and prepare for a fight, and they hastened to surround one defenseless student. They were already waiting in anticipation of a fierce battle. Ross, looking at all this, smiled slyly. "What a show! Attack all together," he declared. The brute laughed. Was the guy's head still not working? One of the hooligans decided that he alone could teach the boy a lesson and swung his fist. Charlie instantly sensed danger from behind, and with a quick movement of his hand, he hit the guy in the jaw. The force sent the hooligan flying and rolling headfirst across the asphalt. Everyone gathered was in shock. They didn't expect this from an ordinary weakling. "When adults speak, you have to listen. There are 4 left," Ross said, smiling. The student decided to give them some advice. Since they didn't really understand, they shouldn't all aim at the same place. He ordered each of them to hit different places, distributing parts of his body between them. "And from different angles, okay?" Charlie asked. The irritated guy in the mask couldn't take it anymore and shouted, "Are you showing off by knocking one down?" After that, they all attacked the student together. Ross skillfully dodged the hooligans' blows, managing to inflict damage on them. But they ran towards him again, not wanting to retreat. Confident in his own strength, he was already taking aim at them. The first blow flew into the back of the guy with the mask. With the second, he hit the other man on the jaw with all his might, making him bleed. However, the guy was still on his feet, although he was staggering. So the next thing he did was punch him in the stomach. It felt like his hand went deep inside. Meanwhile, another hooligan woke up behind the student. He looked at the offender with hatred, and finding the strength in himself, he began to run at him from behind. He was able to grab Charlie by the hair at the back of his head. "Got you. You're finished," the bloody hooligan declared. But Ross watched the movement of the boy's fist closely. So as soon as he got close to his face, he successfully dodged. Charlie was unhappy that the enemy rose again after his blow. What a useless and weak body he has. But that didn't stop him from throwing the bastard forward through the bend. Lewis watched in horror, not understanding how it happened. He looked at Charlie, who was a loser. Was it him? His friend stood next to him and he was terribly angry. He took out his knife and warned that the student was to blame for forcing him. "Don't draw your weapon unless you're prepared to give your life," Charlie told him. Of course, these words made the situation even worse, and the guy began to mindlessly wave the knife. Ross still managed to catch his hand with the weapon and stop him. The guy squeezed her and started to twist her. It was terribly painful for the hooligan. There was a crunching sound and the attacker's face screamed in pain. Charlie let go of his hand and turned to Louis. "And here we are again, one-on-one," the brunette grinned. The recently beaten guy was afraid. He couldn't find the words. Charlie picked up the fallen knife and said, "Don't be too afraid. If you think about it, it's all my fault. Apparently, I was too soft this morning. The day wasn't over yet, and you were already able to plan this," the student continued. He looked askance at the bully. Now he wouldn't make such a mistake. Fear gripped Clark. He was shaking. Charlie gave him a choice, a cut or a break. Now Lewis admitted he was wrong and assured him that he would not touch him anymore. However, at that moment, Charlie heard someone's footsteps. He turned around angrily to see who it was. A teacher walked towards them, full of irritation. He gave a stern command, "Stop it!" Ross couldn't understand how the coach had managed to get so close without being noticed. And behind him, Louis, all in tears and snot, begged the teacher to save him. Charlie and the teacher stood opposite each other in terrible tension. "So you are that Charlie. I heard about your situation, but you need to stop. This is no longer self-defense. This is beating," the man said. The young man did not answer but looked at him with particular anger. "You bastard, just look at his eyes. If you don't stop, I'll make sure you get kicked out of school. Even for what you just did, you could get into serious trouble," the teacher continued. Charlie responded with complete indifference that this meant he wouldn't go. How can a schoolboy not go to school? The coach didn't understand. "I'll take care of this, and you can go home, and a case will still be opened. So if you have any evidence of their bullying, you can bring it." The teacher walked up to the wounded, and Charlie started to walk away. He understood that he didn't need to get involved with this man. Suddenly, the teacher turned to Charlie and asked him where he learned to fight like that. At first, the young man doubted it, but almost immediately answered that it was on the internet. The man was amazed by his strength and asked to come see him later for a talk. Ross didn't answer and walked away. The teacher looked after him and wondered if everyone really changed that much once they died and came back to life. A little later, the student was walking through the city streets. He thought that this was enough to avenge the owner of this body, and he could return to where he belonged. The young man went into a men's salon and got a haircut. Now he looked exactly like Charlie Ross. After that, he went into a cafe. He was greeted by a friendly employee. Sitting down at the table, Charlie asked for a chicken cutlet and a portion of rice. The woman shouted an order to the kitchen. All of this reminded him of his past. Then he was also sitting in a cafe and they brought him his order, rice with chicken. He looked at his plane ticket. Nearby, a child was asking his mother for a chicken cutlet and crying. The guy put his ticket on the table. It had a departure from Incheon to Paris written on it. Finally, Charlie was brought his dish. As expected, it tasted better eating with chopsticks. However, the taste is not quite the same as it once was. Suddenly, the phone started vibrating in my pocket. Ross looked at the screen and it turned out that it was his mother calling. The young man decided to pick up the phone and talk to her. Sophia started asking about what happened and wanted to come and talk to her son in person. But the guy said he'd talk when he got home, period. Charlie cut the conversation off in irritation and slammed the phone down on the table too hard. The young man thought, maybe this is not my style. The image of the student standing on the roof of the school came to mind. He looked at the city at night, how high it was. Tears welled up in his eyes and his whole body shook. One last breath and he decided to jump. These thoughts made Charlie stab his chopsticks furiously into his food. In the end, for everyone, he was just recovering from suicide. At home sat an angry father who had learned about what had happened, and a worried mother. Jim suggested that his son began to act strangely after that incident, perhaps due to a short-term coma. Their dialogue was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Charlie walked into the room and his parents immediately noticed the change in his hairstyle. Father asked him to sit down for a moment, but Ross, without saying anything, went into his room. "You little bastard!" Dad shouted. His wife immediately began to calm him down. Almost immediately, the young man came out of his room with some notebooks. The brunette sat down at the table in front of them and put down his notebooks, saying that he wanted to show them something. "What is this?" asked the worried father. Charlie asked them to just take a look. Jim took one of the notebooks with distrust. Sophia took the second one, and they began to read. Instantly, fear appeared in the mother's eyes. Tears involuntarily flowed from her eyes as she read all the horror that her son wrote. Father couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was a nightmare. Soon the parents were both crying in front of their son. Dad asked if it was all true. Hadn't they noticed that their son was being bullied at school? To which Charlie replied that this was all true and had been going on for a long time. "Then why didn't you say anything?" he shouted in rage. "I didn't want to make you worry, and I was ashamed of myself for being so pathetic," the son admitted. "So since I survived that jump, I have nothing more to fear in this world," Charlie continued. The father calmed down and agreed with him. He sat down, still in a state of shock. Jim asked if the boy felt better after he had taken revenge. Charlie looked down, frowning slightly. The mother was worried that her son had damaged something. The guy answered briefly and not entirely confidently, "No." There was silence in the room for a while. Soon the father said that if this happened, then fine. But he would deal with it all himself, so he asked the family not to worry. Charlie looked at him questioningly. Jim asked him to promise that if something like this happened again, his son would definitely tell them. The young man confidently said that it was all in the past. "But still, give us your word. We are your parents. We have the right to know," Father insisted. With tear-stained eyes, the mother asked her son for forgiveness because they didn't even know all this. The young man looked with sympathy at the parents of the owner of this body. He began to delve into memories of his father and mother, about their apartment, which had been turned into a dump of empty alcohol bottles and dirty dishes. Then my father ran out of alcohol. He ordered his son and wife to bring him more. Charlie looked at his father with anger and resentment, and he threw a bottle at him and again shouted for someone to bring him a drink. That evening, Shouts and curses were heard from their house. Charlie said he promised Jim to talk about everything. The parents didn't answer. They looked down somewhere in disappointment, lost in their thoughts. The student said that he would go and rest since their conversation was over. His father let him go. Just at that moment, someone called him. Jim said he understood and would transfer the money so he would call back later. Sophia immediately asked what happened. The husband shared that this was his client from France who had problems, some documents had disappeared, and they could not pass through customs. Charlie heard his father say that he was told to transfer 100,000 euros for the suppliers to deal with it, but that was about 130 million won. Mom said that in that case they needed to send the money quickly, otherwise they would lose even more. But they were stopped by Charlie, who asked to let him talk to the person in charge. Jim didn't expect such a proposal from his son at all. Just then he received another call and Charlie picked up the phone. The voice on the phone said, "Director, they say they'll throw everything away if the transfer isn't done in 30 minutes. If we don't take care of this sooner." He was interrupted by Charlie, who asked to be connected directly with the client. The young man immediately indicated that he was the director's son, and since they had little time, they should quickly connect him with him. The voice on the phone asked to wait a minute. The father and mother were shocked by what was happening. The client joined the conversation and Jim's son began speaking to him in French. Charlie spent some time talking to the client in a foreign language. Neither father nor mother understood what was happening. Soon, Charlie said goodbye to the person on the other end of the phone. Giving the phone to Jim, Charlie said that they found the lost documents. It just happened. So there are no more problems with customs. The father was happy and shared that they sometimes have such force majeure situations, to which his son replied that this would not happen again. "I said that in that case I would set the Algerian mercenaries on them," Charlie said. Of course, he immediately said that he was joking so that his parents wouldn't worry. Mom decided to find out when the boy learned French because they don't teach it at his school. The son hesitated awkwardly and said, "On the internet." Mom smiled and patted Dad on the shoulder. "The current generation has gone too far." The student bowed and said, "If you are finished, then I will go and rest." Ross went to his room and lay on his bed for a long time, lost in thought. It looks like he will have to postpone his trip to France. His body is not in the best shape and his head has not yet recovered. Besides, now he has a family. He lives with his parents. Charlie sighed heavily, thinking about all this. He decided that as soon as he recovered, he would leave immediately. Time passed and a new day came. Charlie went to school again. Everything is fine, of course, but does a student have nothing better to do than school? He thought. Since he was bored anyway, the young man decided to take a nap and settled down on his desk. He was disturbed by the uncultured Louis, who brazenly sat down in front of him and forced him to raise his head. Charlie was surrounded by the same hooligans who had been beaten up yesterday. The student asked if Clark was tired of all this. "Tired of it? We'll definitely give it to you today, so follow me," the blonde ordered. Not wanting to obey him, the student lay down on his desk again and sent the hooligan packing. Louis smiled strangely. Was the brunette really refusing? "So you don't care what happens to Kate Diaz?" the bully asked. After these words, Charlie stood up abruptly, asking if he had misheard. Seeing his opponent's reaction, Louis repeated with a cheeky smile, "Yes, Keith Diaz." "Who is this?" Ross asked quite sincerely, not understanding who they were talking about. The hooligans suddenly fell silent and were stunned by what they heard. "Just look at this idiot." The blonde was indignant, while the brunette tried to remember someone with that name. "She immediately ran to the roof as soon as she heard about you, and you decided to forget her?" Clark was indignant. At that moment, Charlie suddenly remembered that it was his desk mate and instantly jumped up from his chair. Now his face reflected anger and he asked, "Where is she?" Louis was pleased with this reaction and smiled sarcastically. Soon they and Clark climbed up to the roof. Charlie looked carefully at the people in front of him. 7 hooligan boys, 4 girls, and Louis himself met him. They all looked at him with malicious glee and smiled, clearly preparing for the massacre. "Ross, you bastard! I tried especially hard for you today. You better get ready," the blonde declared. "There are girls here too," the young man thought. One of them, a blonde with makeup, noticed the guy. "What do you want to get?" she quipped. Charlie said sternly, "You 4, leave." The blonde clearly didn't like this tone, and she got angry. The girl decided not to delay and immediately approached him. She started yelling at him arrogantly, "Who are you anyway?" She was immediately shut up by a slap in the face. The impudent girl immediately fell to the floor from surprise and humiliation. She turned around, hurt and in tears, at the guy who hit her, covering her reddened cheek. "Get out of here or you'll die," Charlie explained coldly and sternly. The confused blonde looked back at the hooligans, seeking support there. Louis said they would pay Charlie back by asking the girls to close the door and leave. The insulted girl could barely hold back her tears, burning with shame. Standing on her feet, she ordered that the bastard be finished off. Ross watched the girls sideways until they left the roof. Then he turned to the crowd of guys and asked where Kate was. And at that moment, Diaz just entered the classroom. Her friend started asking her where she came from. Kate said that she came from home, but missed the bus she usually took. The girl asked where such interest came from. Was anyone looking for her? The friend, without saying anything, looked up, where the fight was about to take place. Not understanding anything, Diaz also looked up. Meanwhile, Louis revealed that he had deceived Charlie by saying, did he imagine himself to be a prince who had come running to help Snow White? Here Ross thought, but really, if you look at it that way, Kate really does look like Snow White. In that case, Ross had nothing to do here, which he announced to those gathered. The young man turned around and walked towards the exit from the roof. However, he was immediately surrounded by hooligans blocking his path. Charlie didn't like this behavior of the boys. What, you want to try jumping off the roof again? Louis said disgustingly. It turns out you're a real piece of trash, the student responded to his attack. And then the realization comes to Charlie's mind. The blonde said, again. That is, last time. Ross asked the hooligans, was it because of you? Wow, you really lost your memory. I didn't even touch you. But you asked for help so much that you didn't even notice how you fell, Clark told him. The people who now surrounded the student now revealed their true faces of cruelty and deceit. You should have told me this earlier, the brunette said with unnatural coldness. It was clear that he was furiously irritated. Don't show off. Today will be completely different. I've gathered all the strongest guys from the area. You're definitely finished, said Louis. One of the hooligans started walking straight towards the young man. A huge brute approached him. It seemed that he was twice as tall as the guy. The man looked at Charlie and said, no matter how you look at it, you look like a girl. He placed his large hand on his head, not believing that the young man was really so strong. Enraged by this attitude, the brunette, peeking out from under his arm, said, I really am strong. The young man grabbed the thug's wrist with all his might, and he dislocated his arm so much that he couldn't move from the pain. Covered in sweat and writhing in pain, the bully tried to somehow insult the guy. But at that very second, he received a knee in the face. Louis shouted in panic that he had warned them to be more careful. He ordered everyone else to hit everyone at once, and they ran to attack. Having thrown the big guy to the floor, Charlie headed towards the rest. One after another, he knocked out his opponents in the stomach, neck, face, someone with a kick to the jaw. Another guy got punched in the nose with all his might. Blood gushed out like a stream. At that moment, a hooligan with a knife approached Ross from behind and was already aiming at him. The young man successfully dodged the blow, carefully watching every movement. The brunette stood in such a way that he could grab the handle of the weapon. Then he twisted the bastard's wrist so hard that he dropped the knife. Fearing for his life, he began to shout, wait, wait! But it was too late, so his next move was to poke his fingers into his eyes so that he fell to his knees. The last one left was Louis. Charlie looked back at him. Ross walked around the knocked-out opponents and approached Clark, leaving them alone again. What kind of person are you who feels no remorse for nearly killing a schoolboy? The young man asked in a rage. Louis stood at the edge of the roof and begged the brunette not to come near him. However, Charlie was not going to stop. He decided to pay him back in the same coin. Trembling with fear, the blonde began to cover himself with his hands and call for help. But not just anyone, but a teacher whose appearance Ross never expected. He turned around and saw the teacher heading towards him. Is it him again? The coach thought irritably. The man shouted sharply, calm down quickly! Charlie began to suspect that this man was not an ordinary teacher. Here he turned his gaze to Louis and addressed him. I'll talk to you separately, he said, and commanded, take your guys out of here right now. Tears of happiness appeared in Clark's eyes. He was saved and immediately obeyed the teacher. The hooligans, slowly and with some help from their comrades, were able to leave the roof, leaving the teacher alone with Charlie. The teacher lit a cigarette and said, not even a day has passed and you did this again? Charlie wondered how he knew they were here. It turned out that Kate Diaz ran to him and told him everything. While smoking a cigarette, he asked what they were going to do with it. This kind of thing is really not okay, the teacher declared. What? The student asked him indignantly. Puppy, if you want to be a student, act like one. You'll regret it later, the man shouted at him. At that moment, a thought comes into Charlie's head. Is this just an accident, or did the same thing happen to him as to me? The young man decided to test this thoroughly and said to him, hey, which naturally angered the teacher. Ross began to attack the man with his punches, but he dodged. How dare this student attack the teacher? It irritated him terribly. So he hit him back, but Charlie successfully dodged his powerful blow. They exchanged glances in the midst of a tense battle, and the coach even dropped his cigarette. The teacher continued to deliver a series of professional blows, which the student successfully dodged. In addition to dodging, he blocked and parried blows. The man continued to aim his large fist at the young man. However, each of his blows flew through the air, and not at the target. At one point, they both struck at the same time and dodged, missing. And finally, they stopped in a fighting stance, holding their fists to each other's faces. The teacher was amazed. How could an ordinary high school student do this? The man asked the young man who he was. The guy grabbed his fist with his hand and smiled. "I don't even know who I am." The teacher did not understand what the student meant. Charlie asked calmly and clearly, "Who am I?" After this phrase, the teacher was shocked. His eyes widened in surprise. Charlie repeated again, but this time he shouted loudly, "Who am I?" The teacher couldn't believe it. He asked him to tell the rest. Ross looked the man straight in the eye and said, "God." And together they said, "Blackfield." The teacher did not expect this at all. The man was amazed. Charlie smiled approvingly. It seemed his plan had worked. Later, the two of them came down from the roof and entered the reception area. The man turned out to be the reincarnated Darren. Charlie was curious why the guy spoke Korean so well. It turned out that Darren himself had no idea why this was so. He began the story after you were hit. They dealt with me quickly too. I woke up in bed, as if I had woken up from a bad dream. It turned out that I was in Korea, and next to me in bed was supposedly my wife. Then I noticed that I spoke Korean quite fluently. Ross smiled and asked, "Well, since it's you, do you have a light?" Darren explained that smoking was prohibited here. "What?" Charlie asked, cheekily and disappointedly. "What?" Darren corrected him with a small grin. Ross swung sharply at the confused Darren for such impudence. He put his hand on his heart in fear to catch his breath. The teacher started shouting, "That's it. I don't know anything. I said it's not allowed, so it's not allowed. What kind of nonsense is this?" A student asks the teacher for a cigarette. Charlie asked in amazement if he really was a high school student, to which Darren replied, "It doesn't matter what's inside, but you have the body of a high school student. I won't give you anything, even if you kill me." What a bastard. I understood everything. I myself have no desire to pollute the body. The student turned away offended. The boys looked at each other happily. Ross thought, it turns out that Ken Evans is Darren. Judging by his story, we have traveled to the same time. "Did you enjoy your wife's embrace while I was in the hospital?" the young man asked. Darren smiled and said, "It wouldn't be a pity to kill her." This phrase infuriated the student, but the man asked him to be quiet. "I am a teacher, and the commander is now a student." Charlie concluded that his comrade was in hiding. Here, Darren decided to ask why Ross was behaving like this, since he had been reborn. Why not be an ordinary student? "Do you think I enjoy dealing with children myself?" Charlie asked, stating that they were pestering him. The young man shared that he does not intend to stay here for long and will return to France. "Are you going to go back to the hell you barely escaped from?" Darren asked, completely confused by the commander's decision. Charlie assured him that there was definitely someone behind all this. If he didn't find these bastards, how could he think calmly about those who died so unfairly? The comrades sat opposite each other and silently looked into each other's eyes. Darren broke the silence by saying that in that case he would go with him during the holidays. Ross smiled mischievously and asked, "Hey, want to do a tour?" The man frowned and answered sternly, "What do you mean? I'm actually serious too. Don't reveal yourself and just stay here to live looking after those jerks. Don't let them pick on me," the young man asked, to which the teacher replied, "In any case, I was already quite well prepared and was going to deal with this." The student crossed his arms and said mockingly, "Weren't you weakly prepared against children?" "What? Did your self-confidence diminish after death?" However, Darren wasn't talking about the kids. He was asking if Charlie had noticed anything when he was fighting with those puppies. "Don't you think that was too much for a child's fight?" the man asked. Charlie calmly replied that there was nothing suspicious, since as long as there were no guns, it was just right for children's showdowns. Darren immediately started to get indignant. "Commander, are you sure you're from Korea? But ordinary hooligans don't use knives and bats." "Really?" The young man was embarrassed, and the man just sighed. The coach suggested that there was some kind of group behind them, and Ross chimed in, "Gangsters, really? I'm not completely sure yet, but I think the chances are high. I'll figure it out before the holidays, and then we can go to France," said Darren. The grin on the commander's face made the man confidently declare that he was not joking. But Charlie already understood everything, so he suggested discussing it later. The student got up from the sofa and commanded, "In the meantime, talk to the nurse." He headed towards the exit of the classroom and shared that he wanted to sleep until the end of classes. Darren had no choice but to watch his commander leave. After some time, near the medical office, someone's footsteps could be heard along the corridor. Until now, Charlie had been sleeping peacefully on the cot in the office, but he immediately opened his eyes when he heard extraneous sounds that disturbed his rest. The young man quickly got up from the pillow and sat on the bed. The guy was clearly irritated by what was happening. He turned to the one who had disturbed him. "What do you want?" Startled by the student's abrupt awakening, Louis began to apologize for disturbing him. Clark gave him various snacks to eat. After school, the kids from the first and second grades will drop by to say hello. "You are now the head of the school," the blonde explained. An irritated Charlie ordered him to get lost, and the bully apologized to him again. At that very moment, Clark ran out of the medical room so as not to disturb Ross once again. The young man sat on the bed for a while and thought about everything he had heard. A little later, he went out into the corridors of the school where the students tried to avoid him, looking at him with fear. People glanced at him warily as the boy passed by, but Charlie paid no attention to anyone. Kate, standing near one of the classrooms, saw Ross walking. Shyly, tucking her hair behind her ear, she smiled sweetly and approached the guy. The student looked at her silently, incomprehensibly. Diaz handed him his bag and asked if he was okay. Putting his backpack on his back, Charlie coldly replied that she shouldn't worry. Nothing serious had happened. The young man had already turned away to go about his business. However, a female voice called out to him rudely, so he and Kate turned to see who it was. In the corridor stood the same 4 girls who were on the roof and looked in their direction with malicious glee. The blonde stepped forward and said, "They want to see you, take a minute." Charlie frowned and snapped back that he was leaving. He invited Kate to come with him, and she quickly agreed with him. The blonde didn't like this attitude and she got angry. The girl shouted after those leaving down the corridor, "Hey!" Soon Diaz and Ross walked out into the schoolyard together. Suddenly, Snow White said, "Cheryl, I think she took a photo of you, that girl who came up to us." She warned the young man to be careful, as the blonde was rumored to be sleeping with several guys. Charlie was a little confused, he thought. What is there to be afraid of? You would probably faint if you found out what European children are doing. At the exit from school, 4 serious, muscular men were waiting for the young man near a black car. One of them was looking at his phone, where there was a photo of Charlie, and comparing it with the young man passing by. He asked his comrade, who answered yes. Ross became wary. These big guys were clearly looking at him. "Hey, come here." They called the student to them. Was it really them that Darren was talking about when he suspected the school children were connected to gangsters? Kate began to worry and asked not to go to the men. The girl tried to detain the young man by grabbing him by the jacket, but the brunette carefully removed her trembling hand. "It's okay," Charlie tried to calm Snow White down. And after a few steps, the student stood in front of 4 serious men. "Are you Charlie Ross?" asked one of them. The young man answered affirmatively and asked what they wanted. "The puppy, as they said, has no respect at all." The man got angry at him. Charlie assessed the situation. 4 opponents. If that were the case, it wouldn't be that dangerous. The only thing that bothered him was that there was little room for a fight as he looked back at Kate and the rest of the students. The man continued, "Kid, we didn't come to fight, so fix your face." He pointed to the car behind him and ordered them to get in to discuss something important. "What?" Ross asked, cheekily and irritably. Diaz was standing not far from them. She was very worried about what was happening. Charlie, without looking away, looked at the man with anger in his eyes. He in turn grinned and laughed a little. Snow White looked at the tense situation and covered her mouth with her hands in fear. The thug with the cigarette put his hand on the student's head, saying, "What a fine boy." Not allowing himself to be treated this way, Ross ordered him to remove his hands. This angered the man. "You really are completely immature. I wanted to be more gentle." The boy looked at him irritably, peeking out from under his arm. The student threw away the big guy's hand that was lying on his head. With a quick movement, he grabbed the front of his clothes with his hands so that he couldn't dodge, and immediately he hit his forehead with all his might into his face. The cigarette flew out of his mouth. Saliva and blood flowed. His whole face was distorted by the impact. The young man grabbed him by the collar and the wrist of his right hand and swung hard. He knocked over the huge man at the same moment, and he powerfully hit his head with the asphalt. The man's whole body was shaking. Foam was coming out of his mouth. The surrounding students were shouting, "They are fighting!" The guys immediately started taking out their phones and filming what was happening on cameras. One of the men rudely ordered them to put away their mobile phones. He walked up to one of the students and knocked the phone out of his hands. The phone quickly fell onto the asphalt and its screen was completely smashed. All the students immediately grabbed their phones tightly, shocked by such rudeness. "Little bastard," the bandit said, taking a knife out of the inside pocket of his jacket. Charlie immediately began to take his briefcase off his shoulders so that nothing would hinder his movements. The leader immediately approached the guy with a knife and said sternly, "Did you decide to make sashimi before school?" He said that we just need to make sure that the puppy can't act up anymore. The man understood the boss and put away the knife. He and another thug prepared for battle. After this, two of the men stood on either side of Charlie. The student even smiled a little. The guys were in a good formation. They were clearly different from the older students. "Quickly wipe that grin off your face, bastard," one of them ordered and swung at the student. Charlie, in turn, aimed his fist to strike. And at the moment when the man tried to hit him, the student dodged and punched him in the jaw. After that, he immediately began to deliver a merciless series of blows. Everything happened so quickly that almost no movement was visible. And at this time, the second big guy decided to take advantage of the moment and attack the brunette from behind. Ross noticed out of the corner of his eye a large figure approaching him. Although he couldn't dodge, the guy successfully blocked it with his hand. And with the next movement, he turned around and struck a hard blow to the stomach so that the big man bent in half. The one who had been hit many times was terribly angry. And when he more or less came to his senses, he bared his teeth and began to aim at the student. The man believed that since Charlie had his back to him, he would be able to inflict serious damage on him. But his calculated attack was stopped by a fist to the jaw from Ross, who naturally sensed the enemy's movements. Instantly, a fist from the second bandit flew at the brunette from the other side. Thanks to his agility, he was able to bend down so that the man missed. The young man quickly looked back at his attacker with an enraged gaze, and suddenly he decided to kick him in the head, but the big guy somehow managed to block it, almost falling over from surprise. Charlie stood up on both feet and continued to deliver punches one after another to his opponent's body, while there was another opponent behind him. Trying to cover himself with his hands, the man realized that the guy had gotten carried away and was trying with all his might to resist him. As expected, it's a completely different fight with adults. "I'll have to prepare this body better," Charlie thought. The head of the four suddenly smiled, looking at what was happening. Ross noticed that strange grin and knew something was wrong. Not having time to react in time, the student was hit. The leader kicked him in the back so hard that the blow was reflected in his chest. It was mean, but Charlie stayed on his feet, but he was very angry. If Darren sees this, he'll be making fun of him for a long time. At this point, the leader started talking. "We've seen your abilities, so how about you call it a day and come with us? I told you we didn't come here to fight. It's your business, not mine. It just ruined my mood at the end of the day," Charlie answered him. Apparently, there was nothing left. So the leader began to take his hands out of his pockets. He decided to teach Ross a lesson and make him come with us, so he immediately hit him with his right hand. Although the young man managed to block it, he still felt pain from this powerful blow. At that moment, he decided to grab his hand, which was just near his shoulder. And with quick and precise movements, he began to move forward, turning the man's hand at the same time. Hellish pain was reflected on the leader's face. His hand twisted around itself with a crunching sound. Ross immediately hit the bandit in the face with his elbow. Two bandits immediately rushed to the boss's defense, shouting, "What a bastard! You brought all this trouble on yourself." Having let go of the leader, the student turned to face the approaching enemies again. Suddenly, all the participants in the fight froze when they heard a female voice. "Is this the police?" Kate Diaz, standing nearby, was talking on the phone and said, "There's a fight here." She looked around cautiously and continued, "Address?" The leader was unhappy with this outcome of events. It irritated him greatly. Holding his wounded hand, he turned to the young man. "We'll finish today, but I'll remember this. Next time I'll break her completely," the student responded with a threat. In a short period of time, the bandits gathered, got into their car and drove away. Snow White sighed with relief and said that it was time for her and the young man to go too. Charlie was worried that after her call, the girl might have problems with the police. However, it turned out that the police would not come, as she simply pretended to call. "Well, apparently you believed it too." Kate smiled awkwardly. The student looked at her and thought, did she do this because she was smart or because she was stupid?